I want to invite you to take a journey with me this morning back about 2,000 years. Back to that day that John recounts in his gospel, the day that Jesus showed up in the temple to teach. I don't want you to sit on the outside of the story and look in. I want you to become part of the story, or I want us together to become part of that story. Because when we do, what we find out is that we are in company with a whole lot of peculiar people. And that's what we've been talking about for the last 5 or 6 weeks, is what it is that makes us the peculiar people that the Apostle Peter tells us we are in one of his letters. I want you to think for a minute, if you were part of that story, what particular group of people or what particular individual you or I might be in that particular tale that John recounts in his gospel. I suspect that for at least some of us here, we would be in the crowd of people in the temple who had simply showed up to hear Jesus teach. These are good people. They were where they were supposed to be, fulfilling their religious duty. They were interested in God and learning more about who God was, about what God had in store for them and their lives and their future in this beautiful, beautiful world that God had created. These are good people. They're a little peculiar, but they're good. Maybe a good place to be. But one of the things I think makes this particular group of people peculiar, the folks who were just there to hear the teaching, was that they were people who did a very interesting, now let's say they didn't do something. And I find that interesting because you know the story, you're part of it. Jesus is teaching, and in the midst of it, the scribes and the Pharisees dragged in this woman who has been caught in the very act of adultery. Throw her down in front of Jesus and they say, Master, we caught this woman in the very act of adultery. Now the law of Moses says such women should be stoned. What do you say? And if you were to read John at face value, one of the things that you know, if you and I are part of that group of people that were just there to hear the teaching, you know what we didn't do? Not one of us stood up and said, this is wrong. Not one of us said, what is going on here? That you would publicly make a spectacle of this woman when it's really none of our business. Not one of the people there even suggested that there was maybe a justice issue in the middle of looking at this woman's sin. They simply kept their mouths shut because, what was it the Pharisees said? The law says. And just like 2,000 years later, for many of the people in the crowd, the law trumped justice. Now, if you don't believe that that's true, if you don't believe that the law sign sometimes trumps the right. I was reading an article in the paper yesterday, and I went into the whole issue of whether cigarette smoking is good or bad because it was the response of the folks in Congress that amazed me. Secretary of the Navy decided to issue a proclamation that we will no longer sell cigarettes on Navy bases or on board ship. And he's got all the facts and stuff, you know. The billions of dollars that it costs in lost productivity and health care. All of the issues around how that happens around people who don't. I mean, you know, he had it all laid out. The response of some people in Congress was not to any of the issues that he raised about why he was doing this. Their only comment was, well, it's legal in this country, and that's all there is to it. And sometimes, you see, the law trumps everything else. And for these people, they didn't consider the grace of God. They didn't consider a God who was love. They didn't consider this Christ who was sitting in front of them talking about a God of forgiveness. They simply kept their mouths shut. Now, I don't know about you, but I suspect that was one of the things that was peculiar about that group, and one of the things that's peculiar about me when I'm part of that kind of group is that my peculiarity in that which binds me together is that I think any time you let culture or law trump God's justice, that's what sin is all about. Now, you may not have been part of that group. If you were me, you were part of the scribes and Pharisees dragging the woman in, throwing her down and saying, we caught this woman in adultery. And of course, Jesus wants to ignore him. He's just drawn in the ground. And I've heard a lot of explanations for why that is, and I haven't heard one that satisfies me yet. But that's what he was doing, and they don't like being ignored, so of course they upped the ante by saying not only was she caught in adultery, she was caught in the very act of adultery. Now, I don't know about you, but that says something interesting to me about the scribes and the Pharisees, unless, of course, she is acting out down at the corner of Main and Broadway at noon. What it tells me is you got a bunch of people that are peeping Toms. I'm sorry. You got a bunch of people whose lives are governed by trying to catch other people in the midst of their sin and make it public. You've got people who somehow have this desire to look at other people's dirty linen. Now, I don't know whether they do that because it makes it feel better about themselves, or whether they do it because somehow they feel like they're doing God's work by pointing out the sinner. But that's what they were doing. I suspect 2,000 years later, we live in a culture where many of us do the same thing. You can turn on the TV any day and there's a plethora of courtroom shows designed to help us look at other people's problems and how Judge Judy or whoever solves it. And lots of people watch that, and I don't understand that. True confession, I don't understand why I turn it on and can't turn it off. I get hooked on some of that stuff. And maybe it's because I can sit there and say, thank God I don't have problems like that in my life. Or maybe I look at it and I say, thank God I'm no different than everybody else. Everybody else has the same kinds of problems that I have. But the reality, you see, is that we live in a world where for a lot of people, their focus is on other folks and what they do wrong and the problem and the brokenness in their lives, their sin, to use the theological term for it. And I think one of the things that makes us peculiar people in the midst of that, if we're part of that group, is that our peculiarity is that we're just like they are. Either because our sin is the same or because somehow or another we're focusing on that rather than on the grace and forgiveness of God that exists in the world today. I could find myself in either one of the groups that showed up to hear the teaching or the scribes and the Pharisees that drug her in. And, let's face it, sometimes, maybe you, maybe me, we're the woman. Now, Mary isn't here, but tell her I've never committed adultery. But I have my own special sin, my own special things that I do wrong, that I know I do wrong, that I shouldn't do, and I just keep doing them anyway. I eat way too much, and I don't take care of this holy temple that God gave me very well. Pat and Joe can tell you that on Friday as I was huffing up and down the hills of Sunflower Hills Golf Course, just trying to survive in the humidity. Thinking it wasn't near this difficult 35 years ago when I weighed 100 pounds less than I do now. Maybe one of the things that is peculiar about who we are is that we all, in some ways, share the reality of the woman because we have all been caught in the very act of our sin by others. And somehow, at some point, that may have become public. See, one of the things that makes us peculiar people is that we do share in many ways a peculiar identity. And that peculiar identity for all of us is that in some way or another, every one of us has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Every one of us at some time or another has been less than what God has created us to be as people who were created in His image. Every one of us in the midst of this story, no matter what role we play, and the only role we don't play is the sinless one who was Jesus. every one of us is bound together, maybe by more than anything else in this world, by the fact that we are sinners. We are broken. Whether we're standing on the sideline afraid to raise our voices, or whether in the middle of the situation raising our voices about the wrong thing, or whether we are the ones that have been caught in the sin, we are one in our sin. Now, there's one other thing that makes us peculiar as Christians, of course, and that is because we are willing to acknowledge that. Because deep down inside, we know that about ourselves, and we are willing to admit it to ourselves, if to nobody else. We are also, interestingly enough, the peculiar people that hear a very short proclamation from God. And I leave that with you because that proclamation, more than anything else, is peculiar to our identity as followers of Jesus Christ. What was it that he said? Neither do I condemn you. What a peculiar thing. To the people who in the midst of our sin hear those words and have faith in them. Live them out for ourselves and as we offer them to each other. Neither do I condemn you. Good news. Amen. We close our worship as we stand and sing a very short hymn.